So for doing this problem, we have a piece of toast that's dropped a bunch of times. It lands on the buttered side 28 times, which is 70% of the time. So how many times was it dropped? So we want 70% to equal 28. But we want to know 70% of what equals 28? Well, if we were writing this out mathematically, I actually could use a variable here if I wanted to. I could call that x. That's oftentimes why variables exist in problems, because we get tired of saying of what. We just want to give it a shorter name. So if I were writing it that way, that would tell me I'd have to be doing 0.7. Remember, we got to turn it into a decimal.
Times 100.
Times x would equal 28.
Would it be 100?
And so what would we have to do in order to get the x by itself?
Divide.
Yep, you'd have to divide by 0.7. And then that can give us our answer. So we could then figure out what that number is, what that unknown is. I just happen to call it x out of generic patterns and such. But if we actually do that, we should end up with an answer of 40. And so your answer is 40. But the interesting thing about this problem is that this is probably not how you did it. And so I'm going to show you another way that you could look at this problem and how you could set it up that not only will help you do these types of problems, but will also help answer that question that many of you are probably wondering as you did this of, wait, do I multiply by 0.7 or do I divide by 0.7? There's a way that we can actually know that. And so what we're going to do this time is we're going to combine the two methods that we looked at across the last 2 days. We dealt with percents 2 days ago. Yesterday we brought in proportions. We can actually put those together in the same way because, you remember what a percent means? The word percent. It actually comes from two different words put together. Per, well that's just per, or in other words every. Cent. How many cents are in a dollar?
90. I mean 100. I would say 99. No.
Per 100. A percent is how much we have per every 100. And so 70% is also the same thing as writing 70 out of 100. Which, by the way, notice, 70 divided by 100, it equals 0.7. That's why we have to divide it by 100, because it's per 100. So when I write 70 over 100, that's like a part over the whole. I want to set it up as a proportion. The 28 here, is 28 the part? Like, is it the same thing as the 70%? Or is it the whole? Like the 28 is the same as the 100%. Well, the buttered side that happened was 28 times, and it says which is 70%. So it's equating the 28 and the 70. So I can set up a proportion where the 28 goes at the same height as the 70. And so I'm trying to figure out what that was out of. So I can put a variable down there. I'm going to call it x just because that's so common. A lot of people will call it n or t or something like that as well. All those work. But notice by setting it up as a proportion, I can now solve it that way. So I'd cross multiply. So that means I'm going to do 70 times x, which is 70x, equals 28 times 100, which is 2800. And then we would divide both sides by the 70. Now if we do that, x equals, 40. When you actually type that in and do that calculation, we get x equals 40. Same answer, right? And you could approach this problem using either the last method, the very first one I showed, or this method. But the beautiful thing about this one is you aren't sitting there going, wait, do I multiply or divide? Once you set up the proportion, it gives you the answer right there. It tells you what to do because we cross multiply. All right, so for this one, a student earned 80% on the quiz by getting 56 points. Now, this is another case where I'm going to set it up as a proportion. You don't have to, but I'm going to use that proportion method for everything today because it does help us figure out some of those questions about do I multiply, do I divide, or what. All right, so we got 80%. Whenever I see the percent, the very first thing I do is I write that as a fraction over 100. So step one, whenever doing a percent, write it as over 100. Then I'm setting up another fraction. The only question that we really have to answer here is where does the 56 go? Is 56 the percent or the amount that we got right, which is matching up with the 80%? Or is the 56 the total possible, which would be matching up with the 100%?
The top.
It's the amount that we got right, yeah. So it goes on the top. So the 56 goes on the top, which means that what we're looking for is the total points. And so I put that as my unknown on the bottom. All right, from here, it's just a matter of solving the proportion like we're so used to doing. So go ahead and take a moment, solve that proportion. All right, so when you do this, make sure you write out the steps. We started by practicing these types of problems, partly to build up the steps and make sure that we got the process down. Keep showing those steps, because if you start skipping it, errors tend to creep in. So we end up doing 5,600 divided by 80, which gives you 70. And so then this quiz was worth 70 points possible. All right, so on this one, again, I see a story problem with a percent in there. So the very first thing I'm going to do is write that percent over 100. All right, now, the only question is, where does the 126 go? Well, was this test out of 126, or did we get 126 right? We got 126 right. Notice it says he earned 90% on the test by getting 126 of the points. So the 126 corresponds to the 90. That means that we're trying to figure out how many points the test is worth. The total. All right, from there, cross multiply. It'd help if I wrote the 0 there. There we go. By the way, you notice how it's really easy to multiply by 100 every time?
You should tack on those zeros.
All you got to do is add 2 zeros to the end of the number. And then we divide both sides by 90. And you should get that x equals 140 points. So when setting this one up, we start going through like we normally would. I see a 70%, so I'm going to go 70 over 100. Now we need to figure out where does the 18 go. But the 18 is no longer quite as clear as it used to be, because you'll notice in this case the student missed 18 points.
So it'd be...
We got 2 options for how we deal with this. There's 2 different ways you can do it. One option is you can say, well, if he missed 18 points, then that must be 30%. And so you could actually change the 70 to 30.
Where'd you get that?
And some of you are going to look at it that way, and that's going to make total sense to you. And if that's the case, fine, you can use that. But I'm going to show you another way, because I don't want you relying on that way.
Also, how did you get that?
So for this one then, what we can do is we can say, I know that I want to know how many points it's worth. So that's going to be my x. Let's say this quiz, I'm just going to make up a number here. Let's say this quiz was out of 100 points. What would you do to that if they missed 18 points?
Minus 18.
You'd subtract 18, right? Well, 100 was just the number I made up for the total points possible. Sometimes it's easier if you think about a real number in there, you'll see the way. But that means that I can actually write this as x minus 18 over x. Because I'm taking the total points possible, which is the x. Because remember, and it's always good to write this out if you get a little bit of trouble here. X is the points possible. And so if x is points possible, I can take the total points possible and subtract 18 to get the number correct. That way I get the 70% that was right. So all of a sudden the proportion can do something for us now that we couldn't have been able to do before. But now that we have it set up like this, we can solve it from there. So we cross multiply. When cross multiplying, remember you have to multiply everything by that. Now, the 70 times the x, yes, that's just 70x. But the 100 times x minus 18, you got to multiply the 100 by the x and the 100 by the 18. So that'll be 100x minus 1800. All right, we still got to solve it from there, which, since there's multiple x's, I want to move all the x's to the same side. So that means I'm going to go ahead and subtract the 100x from both sides, just because I want to move them both to the same side, and right now I got one of them on the left. I want them both on the left.
Wait, can you add, this is what I did, I added 1, 8, how do I say that, 1018?
All right, and then once we're here, we would then divide both sides by negative 30. And when you do that, notice the negative divided by negative is a positive, and so we end up with 60. So this quiz was worth 60 points. Now, this problem didn't ask for how many they got right, but notice if you do 60 minus 18, that would give us 42. So it actually tells us they got 42 right. So we also could have figured that out from that information. But again, that's not what the question asked for, just showing that it tells us that we could know that as well.
Wait, what is
Now the most critical step when doing any of these problems is the original setup. This one sets up very similarly to the last one. I just take my percent, put it over 100, do that every time. But then we missed 60 points again. So I end up doing x minus 60 because I missed 60. And if that throws you off, one of the things you can do that helps you immensely is just write this over here. Remind yourself what x means, and it's going to help you to keep track of that. And it's going to help you understand why it's written the way it is. All right, then when we work it out from there, you should find that x equals 400. So the original question, how many points was the test worth? It was worth 400 points. So that is it. That is our final answer there. All right, so with this one, you notice there are just a lot of numbers. We got 3 different sets of numbers up here.
Oh, what?
And we got a number here and here. So how do we put it all together? Well, first of all, I can start with the easy stuff, the 80%. I know that the 80% is going to be 80 over 100. So I can always start there. But from here, how do I put the rest together? And the beautiful part about this is one of those questions that students often ask me. What do I have to score on the last test or the last quiz in order to get this grade? This is how you can find out. So what we do is we start by taking all the points that we've earned so far. And so on the first one, I earned 50. So we got a 50 plus the next quiz points earned, which is 40. Plus, next up was the 45. And then that's all of them that we've actually taken. Okay, so that's everything on the top. On the bottom, now it's all the points that it's out of. Yeah, so 60 plus 65 plus 50, but we still have one more piece of information to use. The last quiz is worth 70. Now, since that last quiz is out of 70, where should the 70 go? Into the top or the bottom? In the bottom, because it's out of 70. And so I'm going to have a plus 70 there, but I need something on the top to correspond to that. The number of points that we earned. Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. So that's where the x goes. From here, All you got to do is solve. Now, right now that probably just looks like a big headache, but actually it's not bad because the very first thing you want to do the addition on the top, do the addition on the bottom. And so when we add them all up, you get 135 plus x over 245. Now it looks a lot like the other ones we've done. Go ahead and now solve that proportion. At the very end here, you notice we end up dividing by 100. Remember when we multiplied by 100, that meant you just added 2 zeros onto the end? Dividing by 100 means you cancel out those last 2 zeros on the end, assuming it ends with 2 zeros. And so then the whole thing is just going to equal 61. And so this person needs to get 61 out of 70 on that last one.